Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be my July wrap up, and for the month of July, I'm really happy to say I have 10 books to chat about. I honestly am not entirely sure how I've accumulated all of these books, but nonetheless, I have some new favorites, a few disappointing reads, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I picked up this month was a recent purchase, and honestly, it's been calling my name ever since I added it to my shelf, and that is When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill. I do have an entire reading blog for this particular book, so if you want to see really in-depth thoughts and feelings, be sure to check that video out. But honestly, this book really lived up to all the expectations I had for it. It also really lived up to the synopsis and the concept that really sold this book to me initially. The story is a work of speculative fiction. It's set in our world with everything being the same except for one very important aspect, and that is women can turn into dragons. And in this story, we follow our main character Alex, and she grew up during the mass dragoning of 1955. And throughout history, women have been turning into dragons here and there, fueled by their feminine rage, but they've kind of been brushed under the rug. Society has really kept this hush-hush, so things can continue to exist as they always had been previously. But the mass dragoning of 1955 was different because so many women transformed that it was impossible to ignore. This completely altered society in so many different ways, from the view of society on dragons itself, but also the reason why women are turning into dragons, and also kind of focusing in on characters like Alex or the girls and women who were left behind. Outside of just this fascinating concept of women literally overnight transforming themselves into dragons, growing wings, growing scales, breathing fire, but the other really cool thing about this book is that it's written like a work of nonfiction, more specifically a memoir. Our main character Alex is essentially recounting her life, her childhood, focusing in on this specific dragoning as she watches her aunt, who she really admires, transforms, and also sees that her mother was left behind, but also in different moments of her life where she experiences different moments of dragoning, and as she also tries to dive and research more into what is going on and what actually triggers this specific event. What's also really interesting too is in between these personal chapters of Alex's life, there's also snippets of society, from different research papers to politicians to news clippings, basically how people are absorbing this new, very unignorable event. And you also see the evolution of dragoning being something that is not just looked down upon, but also viewed as something that is improper to talk about. The meat of this book is really following Alex's life as she has to grapple with not only her own emotions and the feeling of being left behind by different women in her life, but also as she has to take on incredible obstacles basically forced upon her by different men in her life. This book will make you want to scream. It's incredibly frustrating, the different vignettes that you experience, especially because they're not necessarily unique to Alex and her experience. And obviously this transformation of being turned into a dragon is a metaphor explored throughout the entirety of this book of what happens when you're constantly forced to push down your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions into a small box to be lesser in, to fit into society. When you're no longer able to do that, you quite literally explode. I also really appreciate that the conversations around this idea is not necessarily tied to any gender, sexuality, or anything of the like. Anyone can turn into a dragon. It's much more of a feeling than more so a biological reality, which I think is fantastic. This book I thought was really well done. It was emotional, it was interesting, the concept really sung, and overall I enjoyed this and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. From there, honestly, I was just craving a bit of fantasy romance. I wanted something to sweep me away, something with emotion, but also a lot of heart. So I decided to pick up Son of the Shadows by Juliette Marillier. I read Daughter of the Forest earlier this summer and absolutely loved it. I felt like it had the perfect balance of a fantastic main character to root for, classic fantasy trappings, great lyrical writing, and a lot of romance and heart at the center of the story. So I was excited to carry on with the series with the sequel, and this book is actually set sort of in the future, and we follow our main character from the first books, daughter. And we see her have to again go on a journey to try to protect herself, her family, overcome incredible obstacles, and everything is also tied into a lot of folklore and fate and destiny as it relates to the forest itself. This book is primarily set in the Seven Waters. Follow our main character Lydon as she grows up and begins to have to take on new responsibilities in the mantle of the safety of her family, as she explores the land around her home as well, and also has to take on the burdens of fate and destiny. This book is just truly incredible. Juliette Marillier can write a fairy tale like no other. It just feels so classic. It feels so homey when I pick these books up, but they're also so unbelievably emotional. I was crying a lot through this book. The pains that Juliette Marillier will put you through is not to be trifled with, and just the emotional attachment you feel to so many different characters in this world is so successful. I have to be pretty vague when I describe the second book, as I don't want to spoil anything in the first one, and it's kind of better to just experience this book as you read it, and the synopsis on the back is also very vague, but I really enjoyed seeing Light and Strength, and I really appreciated too how distinct her personal strengths and weaknesses are from our other main character we got. Really just get to see a dynamic range of females within this series and complicated relationships between sisters and brothers and family expectations all played out. No one is truly perfect, and the consequences of actions or misunderstanding go through generations, and all of that is really explored within this series. If you want lyrical fantasy with fantastic characters, deep ties to family, fate, and destiny, as well as romance, the Seven Waters series is a great one to check out by Juliette Marillier, and I really did enjoy book 2. Not quite as much as book 1, but I still gave this book a 4 stars. From there, I still wanted more fantasy romance, so I decided to turn to one of the current most popular fantasy romance series out there, and that is the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy. I have gotten so many comments to check this series out. So many people say that it has a really interesting plot, really great romance, basically like the total package. So I thought I would pick the first 2 books up and see for myself. And truthfully, I have very mixed reviews. Before I kind of go into more detail, I again have an entire reading vlog dedicated to the reading process of these first 2 books. So if you want really in-depth thoughts, be sure to check those out. But if you're not familiar, the Plated Prisoner series is essentially a retelling of King Midas. And in this fantasy world, he was able to rise to power with this particular ability to turn things into gold, bringing his kingdom vast wealth. Everything in his castle is gold. You get the idea, but more importantly, our main character Rin is also gold touched herself. She is also considered the king's favored. He keeps her basically inside of a giant cage. No one can touch her or even really interact with her besides him. That is the general setup of the series and kind of the synopsis going into book 1. Book 1 kind of acts as a prequel to this fantasy romance series, and honestly, I despised it. I implore you, if you are even remotely interested in checking this series out, please read the trigger warnings before picking this book up. It is honestly gratuitous with its on-page description of many incredibly traumatizing things. I also felt like, truthfully, there was not much plot, and really not much was really accomplished in this besides giving a glimpse and a backstory to later motivations that we see Rin begin to contemplate into book 2. In between all of that, it was trying to give us a larger snapshot of the political scenario that we're kind of walking into in this fantasy world. We have King Midas. He's trying to stretch his powers and expand his borders, and other rulers around him are not too happy about it, and there's possibly going to be a war. And that's really all you need to gather from this book. Honestly, I only ended up reading about 150 pages of this book, skimming the end and immediately jumping into book 2 because I despised it so much. And I truthfully feel like you can get all of the context and backstory you need by reading a summary, reading the last few pages, or even just jumping into book 2 and trying to figure it out. Ren does at the beginning of the second book reflect on all of the major events from book 1, and you basically get enough context to her motivation and her character, be able to see and understand the character arc we experience into book 2. That is a really long ramble to say that I really did not like this book. Truthfully, if I did not see so many comments from people saying that I did not need to read this, skip to book 2, it's so much better, I would have never read book 2, but I did. I took your advice. I did pick up Glint by Raven Kennedy as well, and by no means was this book designed to blow my mind. I did actually like this book. I was able to read it very quickly. I was engaged in the writing style and the characters, and it also really reinforced my extreme distaste that I felt for Gild. If I'm being honest, the plot itself did not really expand much going into book 2 at all. The sort of setup that we were exposed to in book 1 continued to exist within book 2, but on the flip side of that, I would say the bulk of the story is following our main character Ren as she begins to unpack all the manipulation and trauma that she's experienced for most of her life, and how she has viewed this one single person, King Midas, as good and as her protector, but in reality he is controlling her and basically preventing her from making her own life decisions, and her kind of having to come to terms with this and be open to other points of views, and also just in general begin to question the politics of her land. And this aspect of this book I did really enjoy, and it was nice to see this arc be taken with so much time and care, and it wasn't necessarily rushed, and I do feel like the pacing was rather spot on, and it honestly made me rather attached to Rin herself. And the last aspect of this second installment that I'm going to highlight on is that I also really enjoy the pacing of the slow burn romance. I personally get really bored really fast when the romance is completed like too quickly. I love when it's drawn out, and I really do feel like the series is drawing it out, which I personally find to be very entertaining, and also really makes me want to check out book 3. The plot twist at the end of book 2 was also pretty interesting as well, so I'm excited to see where the world is going to take us next. There wasn't a lot of plot, but there was a lot of character development, and I'm hoping to have a bit more of both in the next installment. But I would give Gild a like negative star review, but I would give Glint like a 2.75 3 stars. It was entertaining, and I'm definitely going to check out more books in this series. And from there, I was not done with romance. I could not let it go. I needed to read one more romance book for the month, so I decided to pick up Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is a fairy tale Regency romance story. Yes, Regency romance with a dash of fantasy. I literally could not ask for anything more if I tried, and this is the first book to a series, and I thought it was absolutely delightful, and I cannot wait to check out more books by Olivia Atwater. In the story, we follow our main character Dora, and she has half a soul. She was cursed by a fairy when she was a young child, and they took half of her soul, which results in her being kind of not very good at social cues. All of her emotions are a bit dampened, and generally she kind of finds herself in complicated social situations where people are kind of confused by her or judging her by how she's responding. At the beginning of this book, she is about to debut into society with her cousin, who she adores, and she is really looking to just be a wallflower for the season to ensure that her cousin can shine. And she doesn't really have much hope for herself for getting married. But all of her plans kind of fall to the wayside after she catches the attention of the Lord Sorcerer, Elias, because he's really intrigued by her curse and wants to figure out how to break it. And obviously, they begin to spend more time together, and feelings begin to grow. And so kicks off a delightful and romantic and fantasy-filled Regency romance tale. I loved this book so much. First, the writing style was incredibly engaging, from the dialogue to the characters. I loved seeing the relationship between Dora and her cousin, but especially watching Dora and Elias form their relationship was amazing. This book was also so funny. Elias is definitely a prickly character, and Dora is the perfect sparring mate for that, because she is literally unbothered by everyone. So his normal barbs that sort of pushes people away do not affect her in the same way. He doesn't really know what to do with that, and she really challenges him because of it, and it's fantastic. Outside of the romance itself, the story does have a bit of a fantasy mystery too, but everything I would say is very light and easy to read. This is like a perfect cozy read if you're just wanting something to put a smile on your face. It's also not very long at all, but it was so charming. I could not put this book down, and I really cannot wait to check out other books in this series. It was everything I could have wanted. So cute, delightful. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I'm happy to report I finally finished one of my favorite fantasy series that I started last year by reading The Last Arguments of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. And this, of course, is the third and final book to the First Law trilogy, and this book was just amazing. I wouldn't say it's my favorite of the trilogy, but I do feel like it was a really strong conclusion. It really also sets the stage for other books that I know are going to be coming within this world. I love seeing where our characters went and kind of ended up, and this was just as brutal and bloody and unpredictable as the previous 2 installments as well. I really enjoyed the ride of the First Law trilogy from beginning to end, and what I also feel like is not often talked about is how unbelievably funny these books are. Because you're following all of these characters with such gray morality, they often find themselves in situations that you could have never dreamed to have found them in, and it's often both horrifying and hilarious. But if you're not familiar, the First Law trilogy is a grimdark fantasy tale following a variety of characters. One of those characters is first Logan, who is a warrior, and he kind of gets separated from his warrior band at the beginning of book 1, decides to travel south where he kind of gets wrapped up in southern politics and a southern magician. Then we have Glokta, who was once a very handsome and really powerful military figure. After being captured and tortured in the last war, he's been left disfigured and with injuries that have impacted him on a daily basis. And now he's kind of like an investigator for different powerful political figures. He tortures people for a living, essentially. And lastly, we have a figure named Giselle, who is a pompous, annoying, not very talented, but handsome military officer. And he's basically just trying to have an easy life. He wants to flirt with some ladies. He wants to make as much money as possible. All of these figures seem to have nothing in common. You slowly see their fates constantly overlap and intertwine with one another. And you also see the stakes of this novel really expand through each book and installment. We have war, we have political backstabbing, we have revolution, we have new governments put in place, we have ancient magic at play as well. There's so much going on. It's absolutely fascinating. And again, because the characters themselves are so let's just say not great people, it's very hard to predict exactly what they're going to do. It is so good, bloody, gruesome, entertaining. I really enjoyed the ride of this series from beginning to end, and I really feel that the third book was a fantastic finishing novel, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. After the gruesome nature of The Last Argument of Kings, I decided I wanted to pick up another cozy story, so I decided to read Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Manansala. This is the first book to a cozy mystery series. And I can truly say with my entire heart, I read this book and it made me starving, and it was also such a delightful read from beginning to end. But this follows our main character, Leela, and she has just moved back home to her small town after a terrible breakup with her boyfriend, and she's now working at her family restaurant once again. While Leela feels like she just kind of wants to hang her head in shame, she is excited to be around her family once again, as well as her best friend. But everything comes screeching to a halt when one of her other exes, who is also a food critic in town, comes in, has some of the restaurant's food, and then dies right at the table. Quickly, she and her family kind of find themselves at the center of the investigation, and she realizes that the only way to save herself and her family is if she takes the investigation upon herself. So from there, we follow Leela and her best friend as they traverse around town, interviewing other business owners and other people in the community as they try to piece together this crime, and it also kind of leads them to an even larger crime than they could ever even imagine. First off, there is so much food imagery in this book, and I can honestly say do not read this with an empty stomach, because I was starving reading this. I was craving Filipino food like no other immediately. The descriptions and how the author is writing with such care and love for this restaurant absolutely shined through. And I know there's going to be like other books centering restaurants and mysteries as well, and I can't wait to read them because the author has a talent in writing delectable sounding food, I'll tell you what. Two, I really enjoyed following our main character Leela. She definitely has a character arc outside of this horrifying mystery that's surrounding her and her family. She at the same time is investigating as she's coming to terms with not only this small town, the history and the past she has with the place that she grew up, and also realizing there can be more than one path in life. But obviously the star of the show is the mystery itself, and it honestly was much more intense and much more windy than I even thought while reading it. Like, I really thought I had the entirety of the answer to this mystery pegged down immediately, and boy, was I wrong. The crime of this escalated in quite interesting directions, but I never really felt like the book lost the charm of that small town vibe and the gossip that comes within small towns too. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I wouldn't say it blew my mind, but I did really like it from beginning to end, and I found it to be very charming as well, and I ended up giving it like a 3.75 stars. This book I decided to pick up was Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. This won the National Book Award, and honestly, I had just heard really good things about it, so I was excited to finally pick it up off my shelf. And all in all, I can say this is one of the most unique reading experiences I have ever had, and the decision and the structure of this book really complemented the narrative as well and really elevated the overall experience quite a bit. But if you're not familiar, this follows our main character Willis, and he perceives himself not as the main protagonist, but instead a generic Asian man, kind of a background character in the show called Life. And Willis himself works at a place called the Golden Palace, where a perpetual cop show is in production, and there he enters every day and sort of works and exists within the background. He dreams though of one day becoming the kung fu guy, which in his mind is the most esteemed position anyone who looks like him can get. Or is it? We follow Willis as he's unexpectedly thrown into the spotlight of the show, and Willis is launched into a world wider than he could have ever expected, discovering not only the secret history of himself and his family, but Chinatown itself. Again, this book is incredibly unique. It's a piece of satire, and it reads so fast because it's actually written like a script. You're reading a story about a cop show with our main character and other characters existing in this restaurant, kind of taking on different background roles of this cop show, but that is bleeding into their literal reality in life. And there is a definite blurring between societal scripted expectations and literal living reality that is deeply explored within this novel. Charles Yu actually also writes screenplays, and you can see that skill set really shine within this book. And it's just so effectively done. On the one hand, this book is cutting and daring and funny and dark and bizarre. On the other hand, it's this deeply emotional and moving story about identity, what it means to be American, what does being American even look like, and the systemic reality of how society forces different people into different roles that it feels most comfortable in. All of those things are explored head on in one of the most uniquely crafted stories I have read in a while. Obviously, this book won the National Book Award, so I'm not the first person to enjoy this story. I truly could not put it down. It honestly felt like a fever dream at times, and I would give this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Truth be told, I went from one strange book to another, because from there I picked up Deathless by Catherine M. Valente, probably one of the oldest books that exists on my shelf and on my TBR, and this was strange. This book was so strange, but strange in a lot of ways that I just love so very much. In the story Deathless, Catherine M. Valente is taking a well-known figure named Koishi who has existed within Russian folklore for hundreds of years. This figure is often viewed as this sort of evil force, a devil, a witch walking along the people. But in this story, Koishi is sort of reimagined and set not only in a more modern time period of the Russian Revolution, but we see it through different eyes as Catherine M. Valente is writing it. But in my opinion, I don't feel like Koishi is the star of the show, but instead our other main protagonist, who is Maria. Follow Maria from the beginning of the story. We watch her transform from a clever child sculpted by the revolution to becoming Koishi's wife. She's basically taken as a young woman to this faraway mythical land full of folklore and different creatures, and there she has to take on impossible tasks, but also begin to fight in this war against death itself. The story itself might sound straightforward, but I can assure you it is not, because Catherine M. Valente's writing is a journey in and itself. It's lyrical, it's beautiful, and the sort of intertwining of history and folklore is really effectively done. Also, I really appreciate the dynamic nature of the characters in this book. No one is straightforward someone you love, and honestly, sometimes you might love a character and then hate a character page over page, and I feel like this sort of wide range of emotions that Catherine M. Valente is able to make you feel is a really fascinating one. The imagery and just the bizarreness of this journey is perhaps not for everyone, but I did honestly really like it. And I also really enjoyed reading sort of an adult story written by this author, as I've read middle grade of hers in the past, which I've also really loved, because she was able to take this really whimsical, bizarre, and original writing into much darker places. Honestly, I felt like Deathless was an experience from beginning to end. I don't think this book would be for everyone, but if you love very lyrical, very folklore heavy books with perhaps a lot of gray morality and a really windy narrative quality to it, nothing in this story is straightforward at all. And I especially would say check out this book if you enjoy that era of history, as it definitely shines through the narrative as well. This was very unique, and I'm really happy I finally picked it up, and I did overall enjoy it quite a bit, and I gave it a 3.75 out of 5 stars. And the very last book I'm going to talk about is a book I have not finished, but I did finally make some good progress on it, and that is The Hunger of the Gods by John Gwynne. I won't lie, I was pretty awful about picking this book up throughout most of the month, but I did finally read a good chunk of it near the tail end, and I have passed the 300-page mark, and I am loving this book so much, and I plan to actually finish this book in the early part of August, because honestly I cannot put it down. This is the second book in John Gwynne's like Viking inspired fantasy series, and the plot has just been explosive from page 1. If you're not familiar, the first one, The Shadow of the Gods, opens up in a very stark landscape. This is a multi-POV fantasy story, and it's set in a world where the gods once roamed the land but have since been killed off by humanity, but tokens like bones and other parts of their bodies kept to elevate different warriors' power. In this land, most people kind of live in smaller communities, but there is a beginning desire by some rulers to kind of force these communities in a more centralized way for them to be more powerful and have more money. Also, there are these different warrior groups where different powerful fighters are kind of going out to try to claim their own glory and their own story. Also in this world, there are different warrior groups of fighters kind of coming together in hopes of finding their own glory and making their own story. In the first book, we're introduced to a variety of different POVs, some people seeking revenge, some seeking glory, some trying to find their lost son, all of them setting out on their own personal journeys. But you quickly begin to see how their individual journeys might actually begin to intertwine in really fascinating ways as dark magic and the rumblings of the gods are beginning to impact the land once again. The first book is brutal. It's a bit slower paced, but the characters are so fantastic. You feel very connected very quickly. The second book is just as brutal, if not more so than the first book. But because we already have this steady foundation of the characters that we got in book 1, John Gwynne has really just been focusing on turning up the intensity of the plot itself. It wastes no time. From page 1, you are thrown back into the midst. It basically takes off exactly where the first book ends, and it does not stop at all. I am about halfway through this book, and it is so hard to put down. Just the shifting alliances, new information is being revealed. It's so brutal, and the connections just become so satisfying too. And honestly, what I do feel like shines at the end of the day, outside of the fantastic combat writing, is the characters themselves, and I just truly cannot wait to see where this book is going to take us, because I feel like I'm not going to be able to recover from it. Alrighty guys, those are all the books I completed for the month of July. Let me know down below some books you've read recently, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!